20 minutes. That is all it took. Not an hour of journaling. Not a 5-step skincare routine before the sun came up. Not a workout, a meditation session, a cold plunge, or a carefully curated morning ritual borrowed from a productivity podcast. 20 minutes. Quiet, purposeful, unremarkable to anyone watching. And yet those 20 minutes, repeated every single morning in millions of ordinary American homes, built something that is genuinely difficult to find in most modern households. A day that started right. There is a reason the first hour of the morning has the power it does. Whatever state the house is in when a family wakes up sets the emotional tone for everything that follows. A sink full of last night's dishes makes breakfast feel like it is already behind schedule before anyone has spoken a word. A bedroom with clothes scattered across the floor makes getting dressed feel like a small emergency. A kitchen counter buried under yesterday's unfinished business makes the simple act of making coffee feel like an obstacle course. The 1950s housewife understood this, not in a theoretical way, not from a book or a podcast, but from years of learning the hard way what happened to a household when the morning did not begin properly. She knew that the first 20 minutes after waking up were not just 20 minutes. They were the difference between a day that ran and a day that stumbled, between a house that felt cared for and a house that felt like it was already losing. And so she protected those 20 minutes with a set of habits so small and so consistent that most people who grew up watching them never thought to call them a system. They were just the way morning worked in a house where things ran smoothly. If you have ever wondered why some homes always seem calm no matter what time you arrive, or why some people seem to move through their mornings without the frantic energy that most of us know too well, what we are about to walk through is a large part of the answer. Stay with us and consider subscribing. We are going inside those first 20 minutes, habit by habit, to find what has been quietly forgotten and what still works just as well today as it did 70 years ago. And before we begin, one honest acknowledgement. The women who built these morning routines were not doing it from a place of ease or freedom. Many of them were up before anyone else in the house, carrying the weight of a household on a schedule that was not always of their choosing. We are not here to romanticize that. We are here because buried inside that daily labor was a kind of practical intelligence that the modern morning has almost entirely lost, and it is worth finding again. Let us start at the very beginning. Number 1. She woke up before the house did. This was not always dramatic. It was not necessarily an hour before everyone else. Sometimes it was 15 minutes. Sometimes it was the simple act of not waiting for noise to force her out of bed. She woke up before the house needed her. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A woman woken by a child's cry, a husband's alarm, or the sound of someone already needing something is immediately reactive. The morning has already begun without her, and she is catching up before she has had a single moment to herself. Everything she does in those first minutes is in response to something else, and that reactive posture tends to last much longer than just the morning. A woman who woke up first, even briefly, stepped into the day rather than being pulled into it. She had a moment, however short, when the house was still quiet and the day had not yet made any demands. She could move from her own center rather than from someone else's urgency. Modern sleep culture often treats every minute of rest as equally valuable and suggests that waking early is a sacrifice not worth making. And rest does matter, but there is a specific quality to the first minutes of a morning that are your own before the noise starts. That is worth more to the shape of the whole day than those same minutes spent at the end of the night, when the mind is already winding down and the day is already behind you. She woke up first, not as punishment, as preparation. Number 2, her feet did not touch the floor until she knew what the morning needed. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. Before getting out of bed, before standing up and letting the day take over, many women in well-run 1950s households took 60 seconds, sometimes less, to simply run through the morning in their minds. What needed to happen before anyone left the house? What was for breakfast? Whether any child had something specific today, a test, a field trip, a permission slip that needed to be in a backpack. Whether anything had been left unfinished from the night before that would need to be dealt with before the kitchen could open properly. 60 seconds of mental preparation while still lying in a warm bed. That is all it was. But those 60 seconds meant that when she stood up, she was not figuring out her morning as she went. She already knew what it held. And a person who knows what they are walking into moves completely differently through their first hour than a person who is discovering it, one surprise at a time. Modern mornings almost never include this pause. People wake up and immediately reach for a phone, which fills the first minutes of the day with other people's information, other people's urgency, and other people's noise, before a single thought about the actual day ahead has had a chance to form. The morning, then, has to be figured out on the fly, in between everything else, which is why it so often feels chaotic before it has even properly started. 60 seconds. Eyes open, still warm, simply knowing what the morning holds before standing up to meet it. Number 3. The first thing she did was not for herself. This one surprises people because so much of modern morning advice runs in exactly the opposite direction. Fill your own cup first. Take care of yourself before you take care of anyone else. Put on your own oxygen mask. In the 1950s household, the morning often began differently. The first action after getting up was for the house or for the family, and that outward direction was not accidental. In practical terms, this often meant putting the kettle on before doing anything else, or opening the kitchen window to let the night's stale air out, or turning up the heat so the house was warm by the time the children got out of bed, or checking on a child quietly before starting anything else, so that whatever the morning held for them was already known. These small, outward-facing first actions did something subtle but important. They moved a woman into the day as its caretaker rather than as a person reluctantly leaving sleep. There is a particular energy that comes from beginning the morning by doing something however small, for someone or something beyond yourself. It creates momentum. The body wakes up more completely when it is in motion toward a purpose than when it is easing slowly into its own comfort. This is not an argument against self-care, and it is not a suggestion that a woman's needs should come last. It is an observation about how the momentum of a morning is built. The 1950s housewife, who began moving purposefully the moment her feet touched the floor, was fully awake 10 minutes before the woman who lingered over her own preparations first. And a fully awake woman at the stove produces a different morning than a half-awake one who is still coaxing herself into the day. Number 4. The bed was made before anything else in the bedroom was touched. We have talked about bed making before in this channel, but the specific timing of it within the morning routine deserves its own attention here because it carried more meaning than it is usually given credit for. The bed was made first, not after getting dressed, not after breakfast, not when there was a spare moment. First. This was not about impressing anyone. No one was coming to see the bedroom. The order was deliberate for a different reason entirely. Making the bed is the one task in the morning that completes a room. Every other morning task, getting dressed, washing, preparing food, packing a bag, is a task that prepares a person for the day. Making the bed prepares the room, and a completed room changes how the morning feels in a way that is subtle but cumulative. A made bed signals to the person who made it and to no one else that the day has actually begun. Not that sleep is over, which is a passive ending, but that the day is open and moving, which is an active beginning. That signal, sent in the first 5 minutes, changes the posture of everything that follows. There is also a practical reason that is easy to overlook. A made bed in the morning makes it harder to return to. Not impossible, but the physical act of having to unmake something that was just made creates enough friction that the temptation to crawl back in, to let the morning slip another 10 minutes and then another, is much easier to resist. The made bed is a small commitment to the day that the unmade bed never is. Number 5. She opened the curtains and windows as she moved through the house. Before the coffee was poured, before breakfast was started, before any of the day's real work had begun, many 1950s women moved through the main rooms of the house doing one small thing in each: opening the curtains, pulling up the blinds, pushing a window up an inch to let fresh air move through. This was not decoration. It was function. A house that has been closed overnight holds stale air, trapped warmth, and a particular kind of flatness that makes every room feel heavier and more static than it needs to. Opening windows and curtains, even for a few minutes in cool weather, changes the atmosphere of the house in a way that cleaning cannot entirely replicate. The rooms come alive because they are in contact with the outside world again. Light, specifically, changes how a home feels more dramatically than almost anything else a person can do in the morning. Natural light entering a room makes it look cleaner, warmer, and more awake. It reveals what needs attention without making it feel overwhelming. It lifts the mood of the person moving through it in a way that is not metaphorical. It is physiological. because natural morning light is one of the primary signals the human body uses to wake up completely. A 1950s woman who opened every curtain on her way to the kitchen arrived in the kitchen more awake than when she had left the bedroom. The light did part of the work of waking up for her, quietly, as she moved. Number 6. The kitchen was started, not stormed. There is a difference between arriving in a kitchen ready to cook and arriving in a kitchen and throwing it into production as fast as possible. The first looks calm. The second looks like controlled chaos. In a 1950s home, the morning kitchen was started, not stormed. This meant that the first action in the kitchen was rarely the most urgent one. Before anyone was hungry, before children were at the table, the kettle went on. The stove was checked to make sure nothing had been left from the night before. The dish towel was unfolded and hung where it belonged. The window above the sink was opened, if the weather allowed. These small preparatory actions, which took perhaps 90 seconds total, changed the kitchen's atmosphere before any real cooking began. The room was set up to be used instead of simply being used. The person in it had a moment to orient before the first demand arrived. This matters because cooking under calm conditions produces different results than cooking under pressure. Food cooked in a hurry is more likely to be burned, over-seasoned, or simply not as good as the same food made with a little more ease. And a morning kitchen that starts calm tends to stay calmer, while a morning kitchen that opens in chaos tends to escalate with every additional person who walks into it. She started the kitchen. She did not storm it. Number 7. Breakfast had a decided menu the night before. One of the quietest ways that 1950s mornings saved time and energy that modern mornings throw away was in the simple decision about what breakfast would be. In many households, this was not decided in the morning. It was decided the evening before, or it was so consistent that no decision was needed at all. Tuesday meant oatmeal. Friday meant eggs. Summer meant something lighter than winter. The pattern repeated because the pattern worked, and because a decision that does not need to be made in the morning is energy that stays available for everything else. Modern breakfast culture celebrates variety and spontaneity, which sounds liberating until you are standing in front of an open refrigerator at 7 in the morning, still half asleep, trying to figure out what to make for 3 different people with 3 different preferences, while also making lunches and finding a missing shoe and answering a question from a child who has decided this is the moment to discuss something that requires real thought. The 1950s housewife had already made the breakfast decision. It was made in a calmer moment with a clearer mind, and the morning simply executed what had already been planned. This is not about rigid routine for its own sake. It is about recognizing that the morning mind is not at its best for decision-making and protecting it accordingly. Number 8. Children were woken with enough time to move slowly. The single most common cause of a chaotic morning in any household in any era is not a missing shoe, a forgotten permission slip, or a difficult breakfast. It is a child woken too late to do anything at a normal pace. A child woken with 15 minutes to spare before leaving the house will create a hurricane in those 15 minutes that the morning never fully recovers from. Every action becomes a scramble. Every missing item becomes a crisis. Every small delay compounds into lateness that leaves everyone frazzled long before the front door closes behind them. In many 1950s households, this was avoided simply by waking children early enough. Not brutally early, not an hour before they needed to be dressed, but early enough that they could move at a child's natural, unhurried pace and still be ready when the household needed them to be. This required knowing how long each child actually took, not how long they should theoretically take, but how long they genuinely, realistically needed to wash their face, get dressed, eat breakfast, and put on their shoes without anyone raising their voice, and then adding a few minutes beyond that as a buffer that could absorb the small, inevitable delays without becoming an emergency. A household that woke its children at the right time did not need to run its mornings at a sprint. It could afford to be patient because time had been budgeted honestly. Number 9, the sink was cleared before breakfast was served. In the well-run 1950s kitchen, the evening reset had usually left the sink clear and clean before bed. But if anything had been left, or if the morning had produced a cup or two before the real breakfast preparations began, those items were washed or moved before the breakfast plates arrived. A clear sink when breakfast is served is not a luxury. It is a practical necessity that most people only understand when they have tried to cook breakfast over a sink full of the previous evening's dishes. With a clear sink, the breakfast cleanup is fast. Plates go directly into water. Cups are rinsed immediately. The whole kitchen can be reset to its clean morning state in 5 minutes because there is nothing backing up the system. With a full sink, the breakfast dishes pile on top of the dinner dishes, and by mid-morning, the kitchen looks like it has been in continuous use since yesterday, which it effectively has. The morning sink check was a 30-second habit that kept the kitchen's entire daily rhythm from derailing before the day had properly started. Number 10, she dressed before the family needed her. In many 1950s households, a woman was dressed, her hair arranged, and her apron on before children came to the breakfast table. This was not vanity. It was not performed for anyone's benefit. It was a practical decision about how to move through the first hour of the day. A woman who is still in her nightgown when the first child arrives in the kitchen is in a fundamentally different position than a woman who is already dressed. The dressed woman can answer the door if someone knocks. She can step outside if the milk delivery needs to be brought in. She can walk a child to the bus stop if the morning runs over. She can handle whatever the morning produces without first needing to go back to the bedroom and begin her own preparations. More than the practical flexibility, being dressed changed the internal experience of the morning. A person who is fully ready for the day feels ready for the day. That feeling is not trivial. It carries into the posture, the pace, and the decision-making of the entire morning. The 1950s woman who dressed first moved through her kitchen differently than she would have in a bathrobe. and the household felt the difference, even if no one ever thought to name it. Number 11. The table was set before anyone sat down to eat. This sounds almost absurdly simple, and yet it carries a kind of dignity that modern breakfast culture has almost entirely abandoned. A table that is set before the family arrives, and it says something about the morning that a bare table never quite manages. It says the meal was anticipated. It says someone thought ahead. It says that eating together, even on an ordinary Tuesday morning before school and work, is worth a small amount of preparation. In the 1950s household, this was not a production. It was a plate, a cup, a fork, sometimes a small glass of orange juice already poured, a napkin folded flat, or simply placed beside the plate. The whole thing took 3 minutes. But it transformed the act of eating breakfast from something grabbed and endured into something at least resembling a beginning worth having. Children who grew up eating at a set table, even a simple one, learned something about the value of small preparation, about the idea that ordinary moments deserve a small amount of effort, that has followed many of them quietly into adulthood in ways they cannot always explain. Number 12. She accounted for every person in the house before starting anything else. Before the real work of the morning began, before she settled into any task that would take real attention, many 1950s women did a quiet mental or physical accounting of the household. Where is everyone? What does each person need today? Is anyone sick? Is anything missing from anyone's routine that needs to be found or fixed in the next hour? This was not hovering. It was not anxious supervision. It was the simple act of knowing the state of the household before becoming absorbed in something else, so that a child's fever or a forgotten lunch did not surface as a crisis at the worst possible moment. This habit is one of the most underappreciated forms of household management because it produces no visible output. Nothing gets cleaned, nothing gets cooked, nothing gets organized, and yet it prevents more problems than most of the things that do produce visible results. A household where one person holds a quiet, updated awareness of everyone else's needs runs smoother, feels calmer, and produces fewer last-minute emergencies than a household where each person's needs are only discovered when they become urgent. She knew where everyone was before she started anything else. She knew. Number 13. She did not sit down until the kitchen was moving. There is a critical moment in every morning when the decision to sit down is either premature or earned. Many 1950s women understood this intuitively, and they did not allow themselves the comfort of sitting until the kitchen was genuinely in motion, not finished, not cleaned, in motion. This meant the kettle was boiling or the coffee was begun. It meant breakfast was actually on its way to the table, not merely planned. It meant the first real step of the morning's work had been taken, not just contemplated. Sitting down before the kitchen is moving is one of the most common ways a morning loses 10 minutes it will never recover. The body settles. The warmth of the chair pulls the mind away from urgency, and the kitchen waits in a state of not quite started while the morning grows shorter around it. She sat down when she had earned it, when the kitchen no longer needed her constant attention to keep it from stalling, and not a minute before. Number 14. Breakfast was eaten, not endured. In a 1950s household, running on a good morning rhythm, breakfast was not something rushed, skipped, or eaten standing up over the sink. It was sat down for, even briefly, even on a busy morning. This was partly practical. A person who eats breakfast while seated and relatively still is in a better position for the next several hours than a person who grabbed something on the way out the door or skipped it entirely. The body that has been fed starts the day from a different place than the one still running on empty. But it was also something more than nutrition. A morning that includes a genuine sit-down, even for 10 minutes, over food shared with at least one other person, is a morning that contains a human moment. A pause before the day opens completely. A few minutes when the household is together in a way that the rest of the day rarely replicates. The 1950s housewife who sat down for breakfast with her family before anyone left the house was not wasting time. She was spending it on something that the rest of the day's productivity would not easily replace. Number 15. Bags, shoes, and coats were accounted for before the table was cleared, before breakfast was cleaned up, before the next task in the kitchen began. The departure inventory was done. Every bag that needed to leave the house was visible and near the door. Every shoe that needed to be on someone's foot was located. Every coat that would be needed was pulled from wherever it had been left the day before. This happened while there was still time to fix a problem, not when someone was already late and standing at the door in a panic. The 1950s morning understood something that modern, rushed mornings learned the hard way again and again. The missing backpack never reveals itself when there is time to find it. It reveals itself at the worst possible moment, when every minute lost is a minute of lateness. The only way to stop that pattern is to look earlier, while there is still time for the search to be calm rather than frantic. 2 minutes of departure inventory at the breakfast table prevented 10 minutes of chaos at the door. Number 16. The kitchen was closed after breakfast the same way it opened, after the family had eaten and before anyone moved on to the rest of the morning. The kitchen was returned to order. Plates were washed or set in water. Cups were rinsed. The table was wiped. The stove was checked. This sounds like a repetition of earlier habits, and in a way it is. But it deserves its own number on this list because it marks a specific and important transition. The morning kitchen had a beginning and a middle. The after-breakfast cleanup was its end. A kitchen that is cleared after breakfast is a kitchen that is ready for the rest of the day. Lunch can be made in a room that looks like a kitchen, not a dining disaster. A visitor who stops by mid-morning sees a room that has been used and restored, not a room that looks like it gave up after the first meal. The woman moving through the rest of her morning does not have a background awareness of dishes waiting for her somewhere, which is the kind of invisible mental load that accumulates quietly and drains energy without anyone being able to point to the source. She closed the kitchen after breakfast. Then the morning could properly begin. Number 17. She gave herself the last 2 minutes. Of all 17 habits in the first 20 minutes, of the 1950s morning, this final one is the one most worth sitting with. After the beds were made, after the curtains were opened, after the kitchen was moving and the family was fed and the bags were by the door and the breakfast cleanup was done, many women gave themselves 2 minutes that belonged to no one else, not scrolling, not planning, not starting the next task on the list. 2 minutes at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee. 2 minutes in a chair while the house was still for just a moment. 2 minutes of standing outside the back door while the air was still cool and the morning had not yet fully arrived. This was not laziness. It was not selfishness. It was the recognition, held quietly and rarely spoken aloud, that a person who runs a household all day and gives everything she has from the first minute to the last is not sustainable. That somewhere in the morning, before the full weight of the day descended, there needed to be a moment of simply being rather than doing. That moment was rarely perfect. It was rarely long. It was interrupted sometimes. But the habit of taking it, of treating 2 minutes of stillness as something the morning deserved to include, rather than a luxury that had to be earned, was one of the reasons so many of these women moved through enormous amounts of work without the brittle, depleted exhaustion that comes from never stopping until the body forces it. She gave herself 2 minutes. And those 2 minutes, taken every single morning, were the quiet foundation underneath everything else the day required of her. 20 minutes, 17 habits, a morning that began before the house woke up and ended with 2 minutes of earned stillness before the full weight of the day arrived. None of this required a perfect house, a perfect schedule, or an exceptional person to carry it out. It required a decision made once that the morning mattered, that those first 20 minutes were not something to be survived or rushed through or spent in a fog of indecision and reaction. That they were the most important 20 minutes of the day, because everything that followed them was shaped by how they went. The morning that begins right tends to continue right. Not always, not without interruptions, but with a quality of steadiness that a morning without shape almost never produces. We go back to what always needs to be said when we look at these habits. The women who built these routines were not doing it freely or easily. Many of them were managing enormous amounts of invisible labor with very little recognition, and sometimes very little choice. We do not need to recreate the conditions they lived in to appreciate what they built inside of them. What they built was a morning, a real one, 20 minutes that set a household in motion rather than simply allowing it to stumble awake. If this brought back a memory of a kitchen that smelled like coffee before anyone had said a word, or a morning that moved calmly even when it had no reason to, or a woman in your life who seemed to make the first hour of the day look simple in a way you could never quite replicate, you now know part of why. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this, and stay with us. There are many more of these forgotten rhythms waiting to be found in kitchens and bedrooms and back porches, in the ordinary hours of women who kept the day running before the day even knew it had started.